All right, well, good day, everyone. Welcome to the 5th of 9 office hours focused on Zowe V2. I will turn it over to Sean Grady, who's going to host this week. Over to you, Sean.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Rose. So I guess we can just start off. So first off is the new features of the app framework. The overall goal of app framework changes in version 2 is to simplify, because we noticed that there were some features that weren't used as to the degree that that was needed, and people would sometimes stumble with advanced configuration. And so we said, can we simplify this somehow to make it easier? So one of the things that you'll notice right away is we've reduced the process count on the server side. So the app framework has actually, within the Web UI squad, there are the so-called web explorers, the USS, MVS, and JES explorers. And in order to run them, you used to need 5 servers of their own plus the gateway. In V2, you still need the gateway, but now you only need 1 server. And the change here is that the jobs and datasets APIs are no longer used by the web explorers because they contact ZOSMF directly or via the gateway. And so these specific servers aren't needed for them anymore. They still exist, but they're not going to be running by default anymore since they're not needed by core Zowe. And the other 3 servers were just servers for static content like images and HTML. And the app server that powers the desktop already has that capability. So we just rolled the web explorers into the app server. So now they have a dependency on the app server, but instead of running 5 servers, you only need 1. So it's an improvement in that way. The next item here is something that was a pain point with the app server. When we did a security check in, I think, Zowe 1.14 or so, the referrer-based security check had an issue where if people's external host name did not match what it was internally known as, the referrer check would need more information on how to actually determine whether or not a request came from the right place. And that was due to trying to support very old browsers. Browsers these days now have the same way, a different way to accomplish the same level of security via the same site cookie option. So in version 2, you'll find that this refer security check is just no longer used, and a same site cookie option is used instead. It works on all major browsers. It has for the last few years, so you shouldn't notice any disruption other than that. Now there's no edge case where you needed to specify the host name differently. It should just work. The third item here is something that isn't quite in that preview build that I linked yet, but will be soon. One of the issues with the app server in V1 is that if one piece of code within that server wanted to reach another plugin within the same server, it would have to, the server would have to contact itself over a network interface rather than just doing a function call internally. And so that required knowing where the server was located, like on which IP address. And that sometimes had issues with if the loopback IP address was something other than 127.0.0.1. And also just it's kind of ugly to have a server contact itself over a network for performance reasons. So what we have been working on in V2 is trying to have that communication be done within the server so that no network level is needed for those actions. So if you've ever used the call service or call route service API, instead of them using the network level to complete the action, they would now be done internal to the server. This shouldn't disrupt anyone when the work is completed, but there are some extenders that we're working with to make sure that's true. So we're not quite there yet, but we will be on release. The last item on this page is a change that's going to be significant for documentation and end user purposes and install purposes. In version 1 of Zowe, we had an issue by which we had a centralized configuration file known as instance.env, and then we had a not so centralized configuration file called server.json, which was only used by the app server and ZSS, but not by like the mediation layer, for example. And sometimes you had to use server.json for rare things, and sometimes when you looked in that file, you might get confused by seeing that the values in there don't align with the values that you expected. That's because the instance.env would override the values of server.json, but it just ended up being a source of error where people would customize it in ways that they didn't expect it to work at runtime, or just the complexities of having people edit two files in the first place. So what we did in version 2 is we'll be removing server.json. I think it's still there in that preview build that I linked, but just pretend it's not there because it won't be on release. The new configuration file isn't instance.env either. It's something else called zowe.yaml. And that will be covered in more detail on a future office hours that is focused on the overall server infrastructure. So there's a link to that at the end of this. But basically, there is one and only one configuration file that you will need to worry about in version 2. So if you have any code that depends upon server.json, you'll just need to adjust it, because zowe.yaml actually has the equivalent structures of server.json, so you can migrate that code. Here's some more features. We noticed over time that the mediation layer ports were very far away from the app framework ports, so we thought this would be a good time to just clean that up and have them be one after the other. And there's even more work on the way. In our backlog, I see an item that says have port configuration be by offset, so that you don't have to specify 5 ports, but rather just an initial port and an offset. So that's not there yet, but I think that would be a nice enhancement over time as well. Environment variable names have been adjusted, and there are some aliases. So there's some degree of backwards compatibility, but you will need to check very closely at what the environment variables are in V2, because some of them have just changed names and others do not exist anymore. And I'll cover more about that later. But basically, we had a problem where we didn't want overlap of environment variables. So we want to have prefixes ZWE, ZWED for desktop and ZWES for ZSS. And just ZWE in general allows us to, have different zones for environment variables that we didn't have necessarily in version 1. We had some prefix in version 1, but not all of them. Another thing that you'll see in version 2, this actually went into recent version 1 builds, but it'll definitely be in version 2 as well, is that the desktop login failures now print information that the server told the desktop, such as that the login failed because the server couldn't be contacted. Maybe you have a networking error. In older versions of Zowe, all that it would say is that the login failed and you wouldn't know the cause without looking elsewhere. So hopefully now you can troubleshoot more efficiently straight through the browser. Another thing that's in version 2 is ZSS 64-bit. Now, at the moment, 31-bit ZSS is the one that's running in that preview build. However, CSS 64-bit does exist in that preview build, and we just have to figure out what's the best way to allow the user to choose which they want to run, because plugins would need to be recompiled to work on the 64-bit one. So kind of which one you use depends on if your plugins support one or the other. But ZSS 64-bit does bring some improvements, such as better performance and higher memory limit, and the way in which it contacts ZIS uses a 64-bit interface, which is improved. And desktop-wise, both a feature and potentially a breaking change is that we changed the desktop library versions. We need to keep current with our libraries so that we can continue to have all the security patches that they provide and all the new features. So if you have a desktop plugin which is an iframe, the library versions really don't affect you per se, not as a product, but they are still in the desktop themselves. If you have a native plugin, on the other hand, these will affect you. But you'll see here that we just jumped all the way from Angular 6 to 12. There should be some performance enhancements that provides. I think plugins may build faster as a result also. TypeScript has been upgraded, so you can use newer features that it brings. And Core.js is updated. There are some refinements under the covers, like RxJS compat has been removed, which it just goes hand in hand with Angular. So that should slightly reduce the package size. But those three are the main library version changes. Okay, so on to the breaking changes.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah.
Sorry, just I think it's in context, the question in the chat.
Sure. So we have a question here that says, will you be able to specify individual ports rather than an initial or plus offset? And I think we'll just make sure that continues to be true. Right now, you can individually specify ports. The initial plus offset is a proposed enhancement that isn't here yet. So we'll just write in the notes that we have to support both. There should be some sort of option in the config that specifies whether you're trying to do one or the other.
Awesome, thanks.
Yep. And then, so for breaking changes, I already mentioned a few, but here's all of it spelled out. These breaking changes that I'm listing are for the app framework, and they might hint at the server infrastructure, but you really do want to attend the server I think it's called the System Squad office hours, because that's going to go into more detail on the overall install and config changes. So for the app server and ZSS Explorers, that's what we see here. And the first breaking change that you see here is that I talked about how we reduced the total count of Explorer servers without changing the functionality. However, because now the same code is being hosted in a different server, the URLs are different. So your bookmarks are going to be broken and you're going to need to set new bookmarks, but the features are equivalent. That's also true of the gateway, which was probably covered in more detail in the mediation layer office hours. But in version 1, there were two patterns to URLs that point to servers from the gateway. There was type/version/name and name/type/version. It just depends on whether your service name came last or first in the URL. And in version 2, one of those has been removed. Now the one that is supported is where the name comes first. So if you ever noticed in documentation or suggestions, troubleshooting, and so on, that we said that you can get to the desktop from /UI/v1/Zlux, that will no longer work. The new URL is where Zlux comes first rather than last. So you just need to update references. The next one here is just about the loopback routing that I mentioned before, where we wanted to get rid of the server needing to talk to itself. It's hard to guarantee that this internal routing will be 100% compatible because of the way in which we've made this enhancement. So it could break, but you can just get backwards compatible behavior by just setting the property node.internal routing equals false within the app server config. I already mentioned server.json being removed. If you have a property in server.json that you would like to see in Zowe.yaml, you basically prefix what you already have. So YAML and JSON are equivalent formats. There's some differences in how you write them, but you can have the same nested structures. All of the content in server.json, you can put into components.appserver and components.zss. Because Zowe.yaml is a unified file, it's organized by component, and since app server and ZSS are both components in there, you can kind of put the server.json in either place, and we've tested that it does merge properly, so it doesn't really matter which subsection you put them in. Probably app server for simplicity, but yeah, so you would need to update any scripts that you have to utilize Zowe.yaml instead of server.json, or, and you'll hear more about this in the system squad meeting, but there's a new utility ZWE in version 2, and ZWE will have a setter and getter, I believe. So instead of writing to a config file at all, if you want to set a property, you could probably just document the use of doing ZWE set, like the one on the screen here, node.internal routing equals false. So that might be easier than opening up a config file for some. Like I said here, for versions, if you have a native plugin, you probably need to upgrade your libraries. You can double check just by trying out that test build and see if your plugin works. If you have an iframe plugin, you can pretty much guarantee that it works. But for native ones, you should check. Moving from Angular 6 to Angular 12 isn't that difficult, and we have plugins that we can use as examples to show you how we did it. The sample Angular app is probably the best example, but I just don't have a link on hand, so I will make sure that's in the documentation. ZSS cookie name change is our next breaking change. This is more of to help developers. If you have two unrelated ZSS running at the same time on the same system, the cookie name that ZSS generates has nothing unique in its key to distinguish which ZSS it originated from. And so logging into one would essentially log you out of the other in version 1. So to fix that, we want the ZSS cookie name to have the same structure as the app server's cookie does, in which the cookie name itself contains either the port that the server is running on or the high availability ID. And oftentimes you won't even need this cookie at all, because version 2 and the latest version of version 1, in fact, has SSO enabled by default because we've simplified SSO so much that there's no reason not to have it on that I can think of. Here's a potentially big breaking change for some. If you're used to running install app.sh in version 1 to install a plugin, you can't do that anymore really, because the instance directory where that script was located no longer exists. And really, we are now making mandatory in our conformance program that if you have a plugin that you want to make conformant, it must be packaged within a component. And this is actually something you can do in version 1 anyway. Components are a collection of ways in which Zowe is extended. A component can be a mediation layer static definition combined with a plugin, or it could have 5 plugins in one. It's just a higher level packaging concept that incorporates our other plugins. So you should be delivering your product as a component. And the thing is, when you have a component, you don't need to run install app.sh anymore. There's a command ZWE components install, which will actually iterate through your plugins and do the install app action under the covers. So it's actually simpler. Another breaking change to be aware of here, I mentioned that some environment variables have changed. Some just have prefixes added to them, but some actually just don't quite exist anymore. In version 1, we had an environment variable launch component groups, which had broad sets of components that would be started. So it used to say gateway, comma, desktop, and that would be equivalent to like, I think 8 different servers. Like gateway was 5 servers and desktop was like another 3 or something. That was just an odd thing that we wanted to clean up. Now that we have Zowe.yaml, each component individually has an enable or disable flag. And so there's a new environment variable, ZWE launch components, which is a list, comma separated, of all the components that are running. So it's more granular. So you would need to adapt any code that's trying to find which components are running by looking at that instead. Likewise, if you were using Zowe Explorer host to find the IP or host name of where Zowe was located, since Explorer only talks about one part of Zowe, we kind of don't use that environment variable anymore because it's misleading. So now we have a new one, ZWE Zowe external domains 0. And that may look strange, but in the YAML, it's actually just Zowe, and then there's an attribute called external domains, and then it's an array. So 0 is just the first item in it. So you could use that environment variable to find out what is one of the ways that you can reach Zowe. We got a question here that says, can that command ZWE component install be executed in a batch job too? I believe yes. That's a good question to ask again on the system squad office hours, but I don't believe it prompts for anything. So you should just be able to use bpx batch to invoke it. What ZWE takes as a parameter is the location to Zowe.yaml and the location of the component that you want to install. So I think you can run it either through shell or a batch job. And since I just mentioned that in office hours, that's actually at the bottom of this page here. The meeting is at the beginning of February, and it's actually the same meeting ID that we're on right now at the same time. So they'll go over more about overall infrastructure changes. So on this page, we have some conformance information. Again, some of the conformance stuff is really going to be covered by the system squad, I imagine. But for the app framework, we've said a few things about that. So number one, plugins must be installed as components so that these new utilities that we have work properly. We did a removal here. There were some things that didn't age well. So we removed the one that said documentation or automated addition of the iframe plugin to the Zowe desktop must be performed by executing the script Zowe install app.sh. That script doesn't exist anymore, so it's no longer needed. The other removal here is, well, again, install app, testing via it is no longer needed. There are some changes to the conformance program as well. We had an item in there that talked about that your versions must, versions of Angular, versions of Core.js, that your versions must match the desktop versions, but we never really stated where to find that information. So we've updated that. We've also updated the link to the UI guidelines. Internationalization, it was implied to be optional, but I think some people didn't understand that and were concerned that they had an English only component. And now we've just changed the wording to make it clear that you only need to do internationalization a certain way if you have internationalization at all. We also mentioned here that you do not need to make any edits since .env because it doesn't exist anymore, but also the changes that you need to make to Zowe.yaml for plain old installation is going to be automatic. Of course, you can do extra configuration post-install. And yeah, we updated some of the instance.env references to say Zowe.yaml. Now I'd like to turn over our remaining time to you all. Is there anything more that people would like to know? We got another question here. If ZWE launch components is a list of all components, does Zowe components install handle whether to add a new component to that variable? Yes, I believe it does. That's something that I need to confirm, but basically that environment variable is not something that you'll find in the YAML file. It's something that is generated at runtime from the contents of the YAML file. So the YAML file has a list of all the components and has enabled and disabled Booleans. So that environment variable is going to be, ideally, it's going to be correct and updated every time Zowe gets restarted. I think that may also mean that you probably can't install a component when Zowe is already running. It might require a restart. That needs clarification. So that would be a good question to save for this office hours. Here's another question. Does ZWE component install handle ZIS and ZSS components? Yes. So ZSS components, it handles very simply by calling that install app script underneath. ZIS components, its ability to handle that is brand new. And so I'm not sure if anyone's tried it yet, but I would like to help you to try it and make sure that it works and fix it if it doesn't. But what the ZIS component install is supposed to do is you specify where your dataset contents are on the USS file system, and the component script will invoke the script that we already have, this ZIS plugin install script, which will copy things into datasets. So it's just an automated form of the ZIS plugin install script if you've ever used that in the past. Likewise, ZIS parameters are recorded in Zowe.yaml, which helps that automation work. Really good question here. Where is Zowe.yaml located if the instance directory no longer exists? So that's one of the interesting parts of V2 that people will need to become comfortable with, is that we actually retain some folders from version 1 and some folders we don't. In version 1, an instance directory had a workspace folder and a log folder. In version 2, Zowe.yaml actually states the path of the workspace folder and the log folder, so they could be anywhere. They don't need to be in the same parent folder. And so since they've been removed, there is really nothing left to put in the instance directory, so it's just gone. So the ZWE command takes the location of Zowe.yaml as the parameter for basically every operation. So in version 1, whenever you would do something, troubleshooting, development, installing, you would always say first, where is my instance directory? Now what you'll say is, where is my Zowe.yaml? Because the Zowe.yaml points to everything else. So we've kind of gone from using a centralized directory to a centralized file, but Zowe.yaml is the source of information for everything else. There's also an upcoming enhancement that's being discussed in the community, not really covered in this slide, but potentially in that systems call, is the ability to specify everything that you have in Zowe.yaml instead in a parmlib, and that you would have the option to choose either parmlib or Zowe.yaml, and that the ZWE utility would be able to read both. So it might not always be Zowe.yaml. There will always be a central config, but it could be a parmlib in the future. I don't think we have a test build with that code yet, though.
Trying to follow Rose's 10-second rule, right? Any questions for Sean before we close shop and let him go? I think next week's office hours will feature the systems squad. So anything systems and install related, that's where you should be.
And I'll try to relay some of our systems questions from the chat here over to the system squad, because I saw a frowning face from Robert about whether or not we can install things while Zowe is running. And I think we need to talk more about that to make it possible, because it would be awfully nice.
Yeah, we don't want to have any frowning faces. All right, everybody. Well, I thank everybody for attending today. I will stop the recording and end the meeting for today, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.